She grabbed a $5 million check and tore it in half. Right there. In front of a 7-year-old girl. In front of a lobby full of people who said nothing. The little girl looked up at her father and asked the question that will break your heart. And I promise you, it broke mine too when I first heard it. But here's what Victoria Hayes never saw coming. The man she just humiliated. He was the reason her boss was walking through that door. Drop a comment right now. Tell me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe every man deserves dignity, hit subscribe. Let's get into it. The check hit the floor in pieces. $5 million. Torn apart by a woman who never bothered to make a single phone call. Daniel Carter stood at the counter of Westbridge National Bank on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and he watched those pieces of paper drift downward like confetti at a parade, except nobody was celebrating. The lobby had gone so quiet that he could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, and the faint sound of his daughter Lily breathing beside him. She was 7 years old. She was holding his hand. And she was watching everything. Daniel had been through hard days before. He had buried his wife. He had raised a child alone through grief so heavy it felt physical, like wearing wet clothes every single morning. He had built a company from a rented office smaller than most people's bathrooms, sold it for enough money to change his family's future, and he had done all of it quietly without ever asking anyone to applaud. He was not the kind of man who needed applause, but he was also not the kind of man who expected to be treated like a criminal for walking into a bank. He looked down at the pieces of the check scattered across the polished floor. Then he looked up at Victoria Hayes, and he said very quietly, "Do you understand what you just did?" Victoria did not flinch. She was 41 years old, recently promoted to branch manager of the Brookfield location of Westbridge National Bank. And she carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who had never once been wrong, at least not in her own mind. She wore a dark blazer with a small golden pin on the lapel that read Branch Manager, and she stood behind that title the way some people stand behind a closed-door safe, certain and completely cut off from what was on the other side. "What I did," Victoria said, adjusting her blazer with one hand, "was protect this bank from a fraudulent transaction." It wasn't fraudulent. "Sir, a check for $5 million presented by someone who—" She paused. Her eyes moved slowly from his face down to his worn work jacket, then to his boots, then back up. "Who cannot provide adequate context for the source of those funds is by definition suspicious. I provided documentation. You provided paperwork that could have been prepared anywhere. You didn't look at it. I looked at enough." Daniel took a slow breath. In his left hand he held a manila folder with every document he had brought the wire confirmation from Carter Innovations' legal team, his personal identification, the letter from his financial advisor, the original investment agreement, and the contact information for 3 separate people at the bank's own headquarters who could verify every cent. He had brought all of it because he was careful. Because he had grown up poor enough to know that a man who looks like he might not belong had better show up prepared. He laid the folder on the counter. "These are verification documents," he said. "The check is from an institutional account. You can call the issuing bank directly. There's a contact number on the top sheet. It will take 5 minutes." Victoria glanced at the folder. Then she slid it back toward him without opening it. "We've already made our assessment." That was the moment Daniel Carter understood that nothing in that folder was ever going to matter to this woman. Not because the documents were insufficient. Because she had already decided. Daniel had grown up in a small town in rural Tennessee. The kind of town where everyone knew your name, and most of them knew your business, and where a man's worth was measured not by what he wore or what he drove, but by whether he showed up when it counted. His father had worked construction for 32 years. His mother had cleaned houses 3 days a week and never complained once about either of those things. They had raised Daniel to work hard and speak straight, and never let anyone make him feel less than what he was. He had tried to carry that with him, after his wife. Maria passed ovarian cancer 4 years ago, 17 months after diagnosis. Daniel had been left with a 5-year-old daughter and a technology startup that was still trying to find its footing. He could have sold everything and walked away. Several people told him he should. They meant well. They just didn't understand that walking away would have meant giving up the last real project Maria had believed in alongside him. So he didn't walk away. He worked. He worked from 5 in the morning until Lily woke up. He worked during her school hours. He worked in the evenings after she was asleep. He worked on weekends with her sitting beside him drawing pictures or reading books because he couldn't afford childcare and wouldn't ask neighbors for more help than they'd already given. 2 years of that. 2 years of nothing but work and Lily and grief and work again. And then, Carter Innovations found its footing. It found more than its footing. It grew fast enough that by Daniel's 35th birthday, he was fielding acquisition offers from 3 different firms. He chose the one that would honor his team. He signed the paperwork on a Thursday morning, shook hands with people in expensive suits, and drove home in his old pickup truck to make Lily macaroni and cheese for dinner because it was her favorite, and because some things should stay exactly the same no matter what else changes. The $5 million check had arrived 3 weeks later. He hadn't deposited it immediately. He'd held on to it for a while first, sitting at his kitchen table on a Sunday evening while Lily slept, turning it over in his hands and thinking about Maria. Thinking about what she would have said. Probably something sharp and funny and warm all at once, the way she always was. Probably something about how he should buy a new jacket. He'd laughed out loud alone in his kitchen. Then he'd made a list. Half the money, $2.5 million, into a trust for Lily. Education, housing. When she was older, security that he had never had growing up and had spent every year of her life trying to give her. The other half, $2.5 million, into a foundation. The Carter Single Parent Foundation. Because Daniel knew what it felt like to be a single parent trying to survive, and he knew there were thousands of people fighting those same battles without the advantages he'd eventually found. And he did not believe that the accident of a good business idea should be the only reason some children had a safer future than others. He had thought about all of this carefully. He had prepared everything carefully. He had driven to the bank carefully because Lily was in the passenger seat beside him, and he always drove more carefully when she was there. And now he was watching the woman behind the counter look at him like he was a problem she needed to remove. "Daddy." He looked down. Lily was staring at the pieces of the check on the floor. Her expression was very serious. She had Maria's eyes, dark brown, direct, the kind of eyes that noticed everything and judged nothing. "Did we do something wrong?" she asked. The lobby was completely silent. Every person in it heard that question. And Daniel Carter, a man who had survived grief and poverty and years of exhaustion and doubt, felt something shift in his chest that was harder to name than any of those things. He crouched down to her level. "No, sweetheart," he said. "We didn't do anything wrong." "Then why did she rip the paper?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood back up and turned to face Victoria Hayes. "My daughter just asked me a question," he said. "I'd like you to answer it." Victoria's chin lifted slightly. "This is not an appropriate place for—" "You made it an appropriate place," Daniel said. "You made a scene in front of my child. The least you can do is explain yourself to her." Something flickered across Victoria's face. Not guilt. Not quite. More like the brief recognition that the situation had edges she hadn't fully calculated. She recovered quickly. "Sir," she said, and her voice had the measured patience of someone talking to a person who was being unreasonable. "A branch manager has the authority to reject transactions that present fraud indicators. A check of this magnitude presented without prior appointment or established account history at this location by an individual who—" "By an individual who, what?" Daniel said. Victoria paused. "By an individual who presented insufficient preliminary credentials," she finished. The pause before credentials was barely half a second, but it was long enough. Daniel heard it. Several people in the lobby heard it. A young woman near the water cooler, a bank employee in a pale blue blouse, her ID badge. Reading, Sarah Mitchell. Customer relations heard it, and she looked down at her shoes, and then she looked back up at Daniel Carter, and something behind her eyes went very still. "I'd like to speak with someone above you," Daniel said. "I am the branch manager." "I understand that." I'd like to speak with whoever is above the branch manager. Regional management is not available for walk-in disputes. Then I'll wait. Sir. I'll wait, he said again, and his voice was so calm, it somehow sounded louder than it would have if he'd been angry. He picked up the pieces of the check from the floor. All of them. He did it carefully without rushing, and he set them on the counter in two neat halves. Then he stepped back, took Lily's hand, and walked to the row of chairs along the wall and sat down. Lily sat beside him. She leaned her head against his arm. "Are we staying?" she whispered. "For a little while. Can I read my book?" "Yeah, baby. Read your book." She unzipped her small backpack and pulled out a dog-eared paperback. She had been carrying it everywhere for the past 3 weeks. Some story about a girl who found a horse. She turned to her page and started reading, and Daniel watched the lobby, and the lobby watched him back. There were 7 other customers in the bank at that moment. 3 of them were looking at their phones. 2 of them were watching Daniel from the corner of their eyes. One elderly man near the far counter had turned fully to watch his expression unreadable. And one of them, a middle-aged woman in a green coat, was holding up her phone directly toward Victoria's desk. Recording. Daniel noticed. He said nothing. Across the lobby. Victoria Hayes was speaking in a low voice to a security guard whose name tag read Marcus. Marcus was a big man in his late 40s with a calm face and tired eyes. He'd worked this branch for 6 years. He'd seen a lot of things. He listened to Victoria. He looked over at Daniel sitting quietly against the wall with his daughter and her book. He looked back at Victoria. "You want me to remove him," Marcus said. "He was asked to leave." "Ma'am, he's just sitting there." "I was asked to leave and refused. That's grounds too. He said he wants to wait and speak with management." Marcus kept his voice even. "That's not trespassing." Victoria's jaw tightened. "I'm telling you, there's a situation that needs to be addressed." "I see a man sitting quietly with his daughter reading a book," Marcus said. "A beat." "I'll keep an eye on things," he said, and walked back toward his post. Victoria watched him go. Then she picked up the phone on her desk. "Ta-time." Sarah Mitchell had been at Westbridge National Bank for 4 years. She had started as a teller and worked her way up to customer relations, and she was good at her job because she genuinely liked people and could remember a customer's name after meeting them once and always noticed when something was wrong. Something was very wrong. She walked to the back office and pulled up the bank's standard verification protocols on her computer. She knew them by heart, but she wanted to see them written down. Wanted to be sure. For a check above $500, $1,000, the protocol was clear. Contact the issuing institution directly to confirm account validity and check legitimacy before rejection. Customer must be given reasonable time to provide supporting documentation. Branch manager discretion does not supersede federal verification requirements for large transactions. She read it twice. She printed it out. Then she walked back out to the lobby, crossed to Victoria's desk, and set the printed page down in front of her. The protocol requires direct verification before rejection. Sarah said quietly enough that customers wouldn't hear. "We haven't done that." Victoria looked at the paper. Then she looked at Sarah. "I know what the protocol requires," she said. Then, "And I'm telling you that I've assessed this transaction and determined it does not merit standard processing." Victoria's voice was very controlled. "If you'd like to continue working at this branch, I'd suggest you return to your desk." Sarah stood there for a moment. She looked over at Daniel. He wasn't watching her. He was looking down at Lily, who was still reading her small finger, tracing the words on the page. "He has a 7-year-old with him," Sarah said. "That is not relevant to." "He's been sitting there for 20 minutes. He hasn't raised his voice once. He's just—" She stopped. Tried again. "Victoria, he has documentation. He's asking for a phone call, that's all." "Return to your desk, Sarah. This isn't right. Return to your desk." The second time was sharper. Final. Sarah returned to her desk. She sat down. She thought about her student loans and her apartment lease and her sister who needed help with medical bills. She thought about a man sitting quietly across the lobby with a little girl who was reading a book. She opened her drawer and looked at the notepad inside. She picked up a pen, and she began to write down everything she had witnessed that afternoon with timestamps. Mr. Carter. Daniel looked up. Marcus, the security guard, was standing in front of him, hands clasped together. His face was neutral, but his eyes were something else. "I've been asked to escort you out," Marcus said. "By whom?" "Branch management." "On what grounds?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Disrupting bank operations." Daniel looked around the lobby. "I'm sitting in a chair." "I know. I haven't spoken above a normal conversational volume." "I know. My daughter is reading a book." Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. "Sir, I don't—" He stopped. Started again. "I don't have a lot of options here." Daniel stood up. He was 6 feet even, lean from years of physical work, and when he stood the way a man stands who has carried heavy things long enough that straight posture just becomes default. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. Marcus waited. "If I looked different today, if I was wearing a different jacket, if I drove a different kind of truck, would she have made the same call?" Marcus said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "I'm going to leave," Daniel said, "because I don't want my daughter to see anything get worse than it already is." He picked up his folder and his daughter's backpack. "But I want you to know that I'm leaving because of her." He nodded at Lily. "Not because of anything that woman did." Marcus nodded once. "Yes, sir," he said. And it was the first time anyone in that bank had called Daniel Carter sir. Daniel crouched down in front of Lily. "We're going to go, okay?" She looked up from her book. "What about the errand?" "We'll figure that out later." "Are you sad?" He looked at her for a long moment. "A little, but I'll be okay." "How come?" "Because you're here," he said simply. "That makes everything easier." She studied him with those serious dark eyes. "Did something bad happen?" I thought about how to answer that. He was always thinking about how to answer that, how to tell her the truth without teaching her that the world was smaller and meaner than it needed to be. "Something unfair happened," he said. "But unfair isn't the same as the end of the story." She considered that. "Okay," she said, and she closed her book and put it back in her bag. They were 5 steps from the door when it happened. Not the thing Daniel expected. Not the phone call from management. Not the apology from Victoria. Not any of the things he had been quietly, reasonably hoping for. Something else. The woman in the green coat who had been recording on her phone stepped in front of him. "Excuse me," she said. Daniel stopped. "I just want you to know." She hesitated. She was maybe 60, gray hair cut short, the kind of face that had seen a lot of the world and made peace with most of it. "I should have said something earlier. I didn't. And I'm sorry." Daniel looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate that." She looked down at Lily. "She's got good eyes," she said. "Same as her dad." Then she stepped aside and Daniel pushed the door open, and the afternoon light came in cold and bright. He held the door for Lily. He did not look back. Behind him in the lobby of Westbridge National Bank, the woman in the green coat lowered her phone and looked at the recording she'd made. 12 minutes of footage. Victoria's voice was clear. The refusal to verify was clear. The torn check was clear. She was 63 years old. She had a daughter who was a single mother. She had a grandson who was 4. She thought about the man walking to his truck. She thought about the little girl reading her book while her father was being humiliated. She opened the social media app on her phone, and she pressed upload. Across town in the regional offices of Westbridge National Bank, a phone rang. The man who answered it was named Robert Whitmore. He had been regional president for 11 years. He was thorough, patient, and deeply averse to surprises. His assistant spoke 3 sentences. Robert Whitmore stood up from his desk. He reached for his jacket. He said, "Get my car." In the parking lot of Westbridge National Bank, Daniel Carter sat in his old pickup truck and stared at the steering wheel for a long moment. Lily was in the passenger seat, already back to her book. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. The number on the screen was from Westbridge National Bank's corporate headquarters. He stared at it. He let it ring once more. Then he answered. Daniel Carter. The voice on the other end was calm and direct. Mr. Carter, my name is Robert Whitmore. I'm the regional president of Westbridge National. I understand there's been a serious situation at our Brookfield branch this afternoon. I want to apologize, and I want to ask if you're still in the area. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I'm in the parking lot, he said. A pause. Please, Robert said, don't leave. Daniel looked over at Lily, who had finally looked up from her book and was watching him with the patient, attentive expression of a child who had learned to read the room. Daddy, she said softly, is it okay? He looked at the bank doors. He looked at his daughter. I thought about the pieces of the torn check and the silence of a lobby full of people who watched and said nothing, and the one security guard who called him sir when no one else had, and the woman in the green coat who said sorry too late but said it anyway. He thought about what he'd told Lily. Unfair isn't the same as the end of the story. Yeah, he said. I think it's going to be okay. He turned off the engine. He put his phone back in his pocket. He opened his door, and he walked back toward Westbridge National Bank, not because he had anything to prove, not because he needed the money, not because he wanted to watch anyone suffer for what they'd done. He walked back in because a man named Robert Whitmore had said please, and because some stories aren't finished until the truth gets a chance to stand in the room. The bank doors opened, and everything that happened next would change every person inside that building, and some of them had no idea it was coming. The doors opened, and Robert Whitmore walked into the Brookfield branch of Westbridge National Bank at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon. Daniel walked in behind him. The lobby noticed the second man first because of the suit, and the suit was the kind that made people sit up straighter without knowing why. But it was the way Robert Whitmore moved that changed the room. He did not hurry. He did not look flustered. He walked the way a man walks into a building he owns, and though Robert did not own this branch, he might as well have. He stopped 3 steps inside the door. He looked at the floor first. There were still small pieces of paper near the counter. Somebody had swept most of them into a little pile, but a few had scattered, and Robert Whitmore looked at those torn white fragments the way a doctor looks at a wound. Then he looked up. "Where is the branch manager?" he said. His voice was not loud. It carried anyway. Victoria Hayes came out from behind her desk immediately, and the change in her body language was so fast it was almost funny. 10 minutes earlier she had been standing like a fortress. Now she was moving toward Robert, with her hand already half extended, her face already arranging itself into professional warmth. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I wasn't told you were—" "You weren't told because I didn't call ahead," Robert said. He did not shake her hand. He looked past her, scanned the lobby once, and found Daniel standing near the door with Lily's hand in his. "Mr. Carter." "Yes," Daniel said. Robert crossed the floor toward him. Every person in the lobby watched. The woman in the green coat had come back in. Sarah Mitchell had stood up from her desk. Marcus, the security guard, had straightened at his post. Even the elderly man near the far counter had stopped pretending to fill out his deposit slip. Robert reached Daniel and extended his hand. "I'm Robert Whitmore. I'm the regional president. I am deeply sorry for what happened to you here today." Daniel shook his hand. "Thank you." Then Robert did something nobody expected. He crouched down. He crouched down to Lily's level, the same way Daniel had crouched down earlier, and the movement of a man in a $2,000 suit, folding himself down to the eye level of a 7-year-old, made the whole lobby go silent in a different way than before. "And you must be Lily," Robert said. Lily looked at him carefully. "How do you know my name?" "Your dad's team told me, when they called to set up a meeting with him." Robert's voice was gentle. "I heard you were here today. I'm very sorry that you had to see something unkind happen to your father. That should never have happened. Not to him and not in front of you." Lily glanced up at Daniel, checking. Daniel nodded slightly. She looked back at Robert. "He didn't do anything wrong," she said. "I know he didn't." The lady ripped the paper. She didn't even call anybody. Robert held her gaze. "You're right," he said. "That's exactly the problem. She didn't even call anybody." He stood back up, and when he stood, the gentleness was gone from his face. He turned around. Victoria was standing a few feet away, and she had heard every word of that exchange, and Daniel watched something in her expression tighten as she understood finally that the ground under her had shifted while she wasn't looking. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "if I could just explain the situation from a risk management perspective." "I'd like that," Robert said. "Please, explain it." Victoria took a breath. She had recovered some of her composure now. She had spent her whole career explaining herself out of tight spots, and she believed she could do it again. A $5 million check was presented at this branch with no prior appointment by an individual who did not have an established account history at this location. Given the amount and the circumstances, I made a judgment call to flag the transaction for potential fraud. That's within my authority as branch manager. I was protecting the bank. Robert listened to all of it. He nodded slowly as if genuinely considering it. Then he asked one question. "Did you call the issuing institution to verify the check?" Victoria's mouth opened. "The protocol for any transaction over $500,000, Robert continued, requires the branch to contact the issuing institution directly before rejecting the check. You know that protocol. You were trained on it. It's the first thing we teach managers. So I'll ask you again." He paused. "Did you call?" The lobby was so quiet that Daniel could hear the second hand ticking on the wall clock. "I made an assessment based on, that's not what I asked. Did you call the issuing institution, yes or no?" Victoria said nothing. "Yes or no, Ms. Hayes?" "No," she said. The word came out small. "No," Robert repeated. "You did not call. You had a phone on your desk. The contact information was in the documentation the customer provided, and you tore up a $5 million check without picking up that phone. I believe the check was fraudulent." "On what basis?" Victoria hesitated. And in that hesitation, everyone in the room heard the answer she couldn't say out loud. The answer she'd been circling all afternoon without ever landing on it because of how he looked. Because of the jacket. Because of the truck. Because of the daughter. Because Daniel Carter did not match the picture in Victoria Hayes's head of what a $5 million man was supposed to look like. "On my professional judgment," she said finally. Robert looked at her for a long moment. "Your professional judgment," he said quietly, "cost this bank one of its most important relationships, humiliated a client in front of his child, and violated federal verification protocol. That's what your professional judgment did today." That was the first crack. Daniel saw it land on her face. Not shame, not yet. Something before shame. The recognition that a story she'd been telling herself for years was about to be told back to her by someone with more power than she had. Robert turned to the room. "I need to speak with staff. Ms. Hayes, please wait in your office. Do not touch your computer. Do not make any phone calls. Marcus." He looked at the security guard. "I'd appreciate it if you'd make sure the security footage from this afternoon is preserved and not overwritten. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "Thank you." Robert turned back to Daniel. "Mr. Carter, I'd like some time to handle this properly, but I don't want to keep you and your daughter standing in a lobby. Is there somewhere more comfortable you'd be willing to wait? We have a private conference room. Or if you'd rather come back another time, I completely understand, and I will come to you." Daniel considered it. He looked down at Lily. "You hungry?" "A little." He looked back at Robert. "She's been patient a long time. Is there anywhere she could sit that isn't the middle of all this?" "Absolutely." Robert waved Sarah over. Sarah came immediately. "This is..." Robert glanced at her name tag. "Sarah. Sarah, would you take Mr. Carter and his daughter to the conference room, whatever they need? Water, snacks from the break room, anything." "Of course," Sarah said. She looked at Lily and smiled a real smile. "I think we've got some juice boxes back there, and I know for a fact there's a whole box of those little animal crackers." Lily perked up. "The kind shaped like animals. The exact kind." Lily looked up at her father, negotiating. Daniel almost smiled for the first time all afternoon. "Go ahead," he said. Sarah led them toward the back. As they walked, she leaned down slightly toward Daniel and spoke low. "I tried to stop her," she said. "I showed her the protocol. I put it right in front of her. She threatened to fire me." Daniel looked at her. "You showed her the protocol?" "Twice. I have it written down. Everything. Times what she said, all of it." Sarah's voice was quiet but steady. "I didn't know if it would matter, but I wrote it all down." "It matters," Daniel said. "Thank you." They reached the conference room. Sarah got Lily settled with juice and animal crackers and a spinning office chair that Lily immediately decided was the best chair she had ever encountered. Daniel sat down across from his daughter and watched her spin, and for the first time since the check hit the floor, he let his shoulders come down from around his ears. Back in the lobby, Robert Whitmore was just getting started. He gathered the staff first. 2 tellers, a loan officer. Marcus and Sarah once she returned from the conference room. He asked them each one at a time in the manager's office with the door open to tell him what they had seen. He did not lead them. He did not put words in their mouths. He just asked them to describe the afternoon. The first teller, a young man named Devon, was nervous. He kept glancing toward Victoria's closed office door. "You can speak freely," Robert told him. "Ms. Hayes has no authority over your employment right now. I do. And I'm telling you that the only thing that will get you in trouble today is not telling me the truth." Devon swallowed. Then he told him. He told him that the customer had been calm the whole time, that he'd offered documents, that Ms. Hayes hadn't looked at them, that she'd torn the check without making a single call, that the little girl had asked her dad if they'd done something wrong. That last part stopped Robert cold. "The child asked that," Robert said. "Yeah." Devon's voice cracked slightly. "She asked her dad if they did something wrong, and he told her no, and I stood there. I didn't do anything. I should have done something." Robert looked at the young man for a moment. "How long have you worked here, Devon?" 8 months. "And Ms. Hayes is your manager?" "Yes, sir." "You were afraid of what would happen to you if you spoke up?" Devon looked down. "Yes, sir." Robert nodded slowly. "I'm not going to pretend that fear wasn't real. It was real. She had power over you, and she'd shown you she was willing to use it." He paused. "But I want you to remember how it felt to stand there and do nothing while a little girl asked her father if they'd done something wrong. I want you to remember that feeling for the rest of your career. Because the next time you feel it, that's the moment you'll know exactly what the right thing to do is. You'll know because doing nothing will feel like this." Devon nodded, his eyes wet. One by one, the staff told the same story. The details lined up. Nobody contradicted anybody. And with each account, the picture sharpened, and the picture was ugly, and it was ugly in a way that had happened before. Because that was the thing Robert kept hearing. It came out sideways at first. Marcus said it plainly. "This isn't the first time," Marcus said. Robert looked up from the notepad where he'd been writing. "Say that again." "This isn't the first time she's done something like this. Maybe not this bad, but she's got a way of looking at people when they walk in the door. She decides who's worth the full treatment and who isn't. I've watched it for months." Marcus shook his head. "There was a woman a while back, older lady came in wearing a housekeeping uniform to cash a check. Ms. Hayes made her wait 45 minutes and asked for 3 forms of ID. A guy in a nice suit walked in behind her and got waved right through. I saw it. I see it a lot." "Did anyone report it?" Marcus gave him a look. "Report it to who? She's the manager. You report her to her." That was the second crack, and it was a bigger one because it meant this wasn't a single bad afternoon. It was a pattern. It was a way of doing business that had been operating in plain sight, protected by the simple fact that the person doing it was also the person you'd have to complain to. Robert set his pen down. "Sarah," he said, "you told Mr. Carter you'd written things down." Sarah pulled the notepad out of her cardigan pocket. She'd been carrying it. She set it on the desk in front of Robert. He read it. He read every line. The timestamps. The exact words. 231 showed VH the verification protocol for transactions over 500K. VH said, "I know what the protocol requires." 233 VH refused to call issuing institution. 234 VH said, if I wanted to keep my job, I should return to my desk. Robert read it twice. Then he looked up at Sarah Mitchell, and something in his face had changed. How long have you worked here? 4 years. And you knew what she'd do if you kept pushing. I did. But you wrote it all down anyway. Sarah was quiet for a second. I have student loans, she said. And my sister's got medical bills I've been helping with. So no, I couldn't afford to lose this job. I want to be honest about that. She looked at him steadily. But I looked at that little girl reading her book while her dad got humiliated, and I decided that whatever it cost me, I wasn't going to be somebody who saw it and did nothing. That's all. It's not brave. It just felt like the only thing I could live with. Robert Whitmore had been in banking for 30 years. He had sat across from a lot of people. He knew the difference between someone performing decency and someone who actually had it. That is the definition of brave, he said quietly. Doing the right thing when it costs you something. That's the only kind of brave there is. He picked up her notepad, held it for a moment, then set it carefully to the side. I'm going to need to keep this. Is that all right? Yes. Thank you, Sarah. That was the moment the story turned. Not the moment Robert walked in. This one. Because up until now, the afternoon had been about what Victoria did. And now it was becoming about what everyone else was going to do about it. Robert stood. He walked to the door of Victoria's office and knocked once, then opened it. Victoria was sitting at her desk. She had not touched her computer, but her posture had changed again. She'd had 20 minutes to think, and she'd used it to build a new defense. Mr. Whitmore, she said before he could speak, I want to be very clear that I acted in good faith and within my authority, and I think if we look at this objectively, without the emotional element. There's an emotional element, Robert said, because you tore up a check in front of a 7-year-old and then had security move her father toward the door. That's the emotional element. You created it. I flagged a suspicious transaction. You keep saying that word, suspicious. I want you to tell me specifically what was suspicious, not how he looked, not what he drove. What specifically about the check or the documentation was suspicious? Victoria opened her mouth. She closed it. She tried again. The amount? The amount was verifiable in 5 minutes. What else? The lack of prior appointment. People don't need appointments to deposit checks. What else? She stopped herself, and Robert watched her. Watched her hear the word that had almost come out. His appearance. She caught it just before it crossed the line into something she could never take back. But the stumble said it. There's nothing else is there, Robert said. It wasn't a question. There's the amount which you could have verified. There's the lack of appointment which isn't required. And then there's a set of assumptions you made about a man based on his jacket and his truck and the fact that he had his kid with him. That's what's underneath all of this. And I think somewhere in there you know it. Victoria's jaw was tight. That's a serious accusation. It is. And I'm not making it lightly. I've spent the last half hour talking to your staff. This afternoon isn't the first time, Ms. Hayes. There's a pattern. Multiple people described it independently. The housekeeper who waited 45 minutes. The way you sort people at the door. Your own team has watched it for months and been too afraid of you to say anything. The color drained out of Victoria's face. That was the crack that finally went all the way through. Not the check. Not the protocol. The word pattern. Because Victoria could argue about one afternoon. She could frame one decision as a judgment call. But a pattern was a mirror, and she was looking at it now, and she did not like what was looking back. They're lying, she said, but it came out weak. 5 people, independently, including your security guard who has no reason to invent anything, and a customer relations rep who wrote down timestamps as it happened. Robert shook his head slowly. Nobody's lying, Ms. Hayes. That's the part you're going to have to sit with. For a moment, Victoria said nothing, and then for the first time all afternoon, something cracked in her that wasn't strategy. Her composure slipped just for a second, and underneath it, Daniel wasn't there to see it, but Robert was, and what Robert saw was fear. Real fear. The fear of a person who has built her entire identity around being the one in control, being the one who decides being the one. Nobody questions watching all of it come apart in the space of a single afternoon. "I've given 11 years to this company," she said, and her voice wasn't steady anymore. "I know you have. I built this branch's numbers up from nothing. I have the best efficiency metrics in the region. You know that. You've seen the reports." "I have seen the reports," Robert said. "Your numbers are excellent. Nobody's questioning your competence." He paused. "But I've learned something over 30 years. Ms. Hayes, how a person treats the customer, they think doesn't matter, tells you everything about them. Everything. The numbers don't mean anything if the way you get them is by deciding some people are worth less than others. And that's what you did today. You looked at a man and his little girl, and you decided they were worth less." Victoria looked down at her desk. "I need you to remain here for now," Robert said more gently. "There's going to be a formal process. You'll have every opportunity to respond. But the security footage, the staff statements, and the customer relations log all need to be reviewed, and until that's done, you're going to step back from branch operations. I'm sorry it's come to this. I genuinely am." He turned to leave. "Mr. Whitmore." He stopped. Victoria was looking up at him, and there was something almost pleading in her face now. "Who is he? Who is he, the customer? You knew his name before you got here. You crouched down to talk to his daughter. Who is he?" Robert looked at her for a long moment, and then he told her. "His name is Daniel Carter," Robert said. "He's the founder of Carter Innovations. 3 weeks ago, he sold his company. This bank has been trying to build a relationship with him for over a year, because his firm is exactly the kind of client that changes a region's entire portfolio. I was on my way here this afternoon to meet with him about a 9-figure partnership." He paused. "The $5 million check you tore up, half of it was going into a trust for his daughter. The other half was going to start a foundation to help single parents. He told my assistant that on the phone last week. That's who he is, Ms. Hayes. That's the man you decided didn't belong in your bank." Victoria Hayes stared at him. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. Robert closed the door quietly behind him. He walked down the hallway toward the conference room, and as he walked, he let out a long breath because none of this brought him any pleasure. He'd hoped driving over that maybe there had been a genuine misunderstanding, a confusing situation, an honest error, those he could have worked with, those he could have smoothed over with an apology and a corrected transaction. But there had been no misunderstanding. There had been a choice. And now there would be consequences. He reached the conference room and looked through the glass panel in the door before he knocked. Daniel Carter was sitting with his daughter, and Lily was showing him something she'd built out of animal crackers on the table, some kind of animal cracker tower, precarious and ambitious. And Daniel was watching her with the expression of a man who had spent 4 years learning how to find small good things in the middle of hard days. Robert stood there for a second watching them. Then he knocked and went in. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry to keep you waiting." Daniel looked up. "It's all right. She's been building a zoo." "It's a tower," Lily corrected. "The animals live in a tower now. It's more efficient." Robert almost laughed. "That's very forward thinking." He sat down across from Daniel. He put Sarah's notepad on the table between them and the printed protocol and a manila folder of his own. "I want to tell you where things stand," he said. "And then I want to tell you what I think should happen. But I want to be clear about something first." He looked Daniel in the eye. "Everything I'm going to say I'd be saying, even if you were exactly the man Ms. Hayes assumed you were. A guy in a work jacket who drove an old truck and cashes a small check. If she'd treated that man the way she treated you today, I'd be sitting in this same chair having this same conversation. This isn't about who you turned out to be. It's about how a person was treated. I need you to know that's where I'm coming from." Daniel studied him. He'd spent the whole afternoon being read wrong by one person. Now he was being read by another, and he'd learned enough about people over the years to know the difference between a man protecting a business relationship and a man protecting a principle. This one, he decided, was the second kind. "I appreciate that," Daniel said. "I do. It's actually the only thing I've wanted to hear all day." He glanced at Lily, then back at Robert. "Because the money was never the point. I've got the money. Tearing up a check doesn't make it disappear. The funds are still in the account. You and I both know that. She didn't cost me anything I can't replace. His voice dropped slightly. What she cost me was standing in a room full of people while my daughter asked me if we'd done something wrong. That's what I can't get back. That moment already happened. You can't unhappen it. Robert nodded slowly. No, he said. You can't. So here's what I need you to understand. Daniel leaned forward. I'm not interested in revenge. I want to say that right now before we go any further. I don't want you to fire that woman just so I can feel better about my afternoon. That's not what I'm after. Robert waited. He'd expected a lot of possible responses from Daniel Carter. He had not expected that one. Then what are you after, Mr. Carter? Daniel looked at his daughter's ridiculous animal cracker tower. He looked back at Robert. I want to make sure this never happens to the next person who walks in here looking like I did, he said. The one who doesn't have a 9-figure meeting scheduled. The one whose name nobody important knows. The single mom cashing her paycheck. The old man in the housekeeping uniform. He paused. Because I got a phone call from the regional president. I got rescued. But you and I both know that 99 times out of 100, the guy who looks like me doesn't get rescued. He just gets shown the door, and nobody ever finds out. The room was very quiet. Lily had stopped building. She was watching her father with those serious dark eyes, listening in the way children listen when they can tell something important is being said, even if they don't understand all of it. Robert Whitmore sat back in his chair. In 30 years of banking, he had sat across from angry customers, litigious customers, customers who wanted blood, and customers who wanted checks with a lot of zeros on them. He had never once sat across from a man who'd been humiliated in front of his own child and responded by asking for the next stranger to be treated better. Mr. Carter, Robert said slowly, I've been doing this a long time, and I'm not sure I've ever heard anyone answer that question the way you just did. Daniel shrugged. My wife used to say something, he said. She's gone now, 4 years. But she used to say that you can tell what a person actually believes by watching what they do when nobody's making them do it. He glanced at Lily. Nobody's making me do this. So I figure this is the part that counts. Robert looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened his own manila folder, took out a pen, and set it on the table. Then let's talk about what happens next, he said. Because I think you and I are going to change some things around here. And I don't think it's going to stop at this branch. Outside the conference room down the hall, Victoria Hayes sat alone in her office with the door closed, staring at a computer she wasn't allowed to touch in a chair that used to feel like a throne, listening to the muffled sound of a little girl laughing somewhere in the building, and understanding for the first time in her career that the person she'd decided didn't matter was the only person in the building who'd had the power to destroy her, and had chosen instead to do something else entirely. She just didn't know yet what that something else was going to be. What Daniel didn't know yet, and what Robert Whitmore was about to find out, was that the something else Daniel had chosen would end up reaching further than either of them imagined when they sat down in that conference room at 3:15 in the afternoon. Robert clicked his pen. Before we build anything, he said, I need to finish the part that isn't pleasant. There's a process. I want you to understand it because you're going to be part of some of it, and I don't want any surprises. Go ahead, Daniel said. First thing that happens is the footage gets pulled and reviewed by our compliance team, not by me. I want it out of my hands, specifically, so nobody can ever say the regional president cleaned it up to protect a big client. The staff statements go to the same team. Sarah's log goes with them. He tapped the notepad. Then there's an internal review board. Ms. Hayes gets to respond. She gets representation if she wants it. It's a real process, not a firing squad. I want to be fair even to somebody who wasn't. Daniel nodded slowly. That's more than she gave me. It is, Robert agreed. But that's the point. We don't get to be the thing we're correcting. Lily, who had gone back to rebuilding her animal cracker tower, looked up at that. That's what my dad says, she announced. He says you can't fix mean with more mean. Robert looked at her, then at Daniel. She's paraphrasing, Daniel said, a little embarrassed. She's paraphrasing well, Robert said. Just then, there was a knock at the conference room door, and Sarah leaned in. Her face had changed since the last time she'd been in the room. Something was wrong. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry to interrupt. Marcus needs you. It's about the footage." Robert stood immediately. "Is there a problem with it?" Sarah hesitated. "You should just come see." Daniel felt something cold move through his chest. He looked at Lily. "Stay here, baby. Keep building. I'll be right back." "Is something bad happening again?" Lily asked. "I don't know yet," Daniel said honestly. "But I'll come tell you either way." He followed Robert and Sarah down the hall to the small security room where Marcus was standing over a monitor, arms crossed, jaw set hard. "Tell them," Sarah said. Marcus turned. "When Mr. Whitmore asked me to preserve the footage, I went straight to the system to lock it. Standard thing, you flag it so it can't get overwritten on the automatic loop." He pointed at the screen. "But somebody already tried to delete this afternoon's file, 15 minutes ago, while you were talking to the staff." The room went silent. "Tried?" Robert said carefully. "You said tried. It's a big file, high resolution. The delete was still processing when I locked the system. I caught it about 80% through and stopped it." Marcus's face was grim. "I recovered it. All of it. But somebody sat down at a terminal and tried to make this afternoon disappear." Robert's voice was very quiet. "Which terminal?" Marcus turned the monitor. On the screen was a login record, a timestamp, and a username. "Hers," Marcus said. "She logged in remotely from her office computer, the one you told her not to touch." Daniel watched Robert Whitmore's face change, and it was the first time all afternoon he'd seen the regional president look genuinely angry. Not stern, not disappointed, angry. "She was told not to touch that computer," Robert said. "I told her myself, 15 minutes ago." "She touched it," Marcus said. "And she used her admin credentials to go into the security archive and try to wipe the file that proves what she did." That was the twist that changed everything, and Daniel understood it the moment it landed. Because up until that instant, there had been a version of the story where Victoria Hayes was a proud woman who'd made a terrible judgment call and dug in too deep to climb out. A person could feel something almost like pity for that version of her. That version was human. That version made a mistake. But this was not a mistake. This was a cover-up. You don't try to delete evidence of an honest error. You delete evidence when you know what you did was wrong, and you're trying to make sure nobody can prove it. The attempted deletion was a confession. It was Victoria Hayes telling the truth about herself in the only language that couldn't be spun. Robert stood very still for a moment. "Sarah," he said, "get compliance on the phone, not the regional compliance officer corporate. I want this documented before I do anything else because what she just did is not a branch matter anymore. Attempting to destroy security records during an active review is a fireable offense on its own, and depending on what corporate decides, it may be more than that." Sarah nodded and hurried out. Marcus looked at Robert. "You want me to keep her out of the system? Lock her out of everything, every credential she has, right now." Robert exhaled. "And Marcus, thank you. If you hadn't moved when you did, we'd be having a very different conversation." "I've been waiting a long time for somebody to finally look at what happens in this branch," Marcus said. "I wasn't about to let her erase it." Robert turned to Daniel. "I owe you an apology on top of the one I already gave you. I told you there'd be a fair process. And while we were sitting in that room trying to be fair, she was down the hall trying to destroy the evidence." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "You know what the worst part is," he said finally. "It's not even that she tried, it's that she thought it would work. She really believed she could make it disappear. That tells you how many times something like this probably did disappear before today." He looked at the frozen image on the monitor, his own figure, small, standing at the counter with Lily beside him. "How many people came through here and got treated like I did, and there was no footage, no witness who wrote it down, no regional president with a meeting on the calendar? How many of them just went home and thought it was their fault? Nobody in the room had an answer for that. Because they all knew the answer was too many." Robert walked back toward Victoria's office with Daniel beside him, and this time he didn't knock. He opened the door. Victoria was sitting at her desk, and the computer screen in front of her was dark now. Marcus had locked it out from the security room, and she was staring at it with the frozen expression of someone who had just watched a door close that she'd been sure would stay open. "You tried to delete the footage," Robert said. It wasn't a question. Victoria's head came up. "I don't know what you're—" "Don't." Robert's voice cut clean across hers. "Don't do that. Marcus has the login record, your credentials, your terminal time-stamped 15 minutes ago. He recovered the file before you finished. I'm going to give you exactly one chance to not make this worse by lying to me directly. Did you try to delete the security footage from this afternoon?" Victoria stared at him. And Daniel watched her do the math. He'd watched people do this kind of math before, the fast, desperate calculation of whether a lie still had any road left in front of it, or whether it had run out of pavement. He watched her look for an exit and find every one of them locked. "I was reviewing the file," she said. "For the record, I wasn't deleting it. You initiated a delete command. That's not reviewing." Robert shook his head slowly. "I told you not to touch that computer. I stood right there and told you. And the second I walked out, you went into the security archive and tried to erase the proof of what you did to a customer and his little girl." "I was protecting myself," Victoria said, and the moment the words were out of her mouth, Daniel saw her realize what she'd admitted. The room went silent. "Protecting yourself," Robert repeated softly. "From what, Ms. Hayes? If you did nothing wrong, there was nothing on that footage to protect yourself from. You just told me the truth. You tried to destroy it because you knew exactly what it showed." Victoria's face crumpled just slightly, just at the edges, the composure she'd worn like armor all afternoon finally failing her. "You don't understand," she said, and her voice had dropped, and for the first time it didn't sound like a manager talking to a subordinate's superior. It sounded like a person. "I have worked my entire life to get here. Everything. I put myself through school. I took the shifts nobody wanted. I got passed over 3 times before they finally made me manager, and every single time it was some guy with half my numbers who golfed with the right people. I earned this. I earned every inch of it." Her hands were trembling now. "And you're telling me it's all gone because of one afternoon?" Daniel stood in the doorway, and he felt something complicated move through him, because he could hear the truth in what she was saying. He didn't doubt for a second that Victoria Hayes had fought hard for what she had. He didn't doubt she'd been overlooked and underestimated and made to prove herself twice over. That part was probably all true. But he'd also heard something else in it, and he decided in that moment to say it. "Can I say something?" Daniel asked. Robert looked at him, surprised, then nodded. Daniel stepped into the office. Victoria looked up at him, and there was something raw and defensive in her eyes, the look of a cornered person waiting to be hit. "You just told a story about being underestimated," Daniel said quietly. "About people looking at you and deciding you weren't worth as much as some guy who golfed with the boss. About being judged for what you looked like on paper instead of what you could actually do." Victoria said nothing. "That's the exact thing you did to me today," Daniel said. "Word for word. You looked at me and decided I wasn't worth the 5-minute phone call. You judged me by my jacket the same way those people judged you by whatever they judged you by." He shook his head slowly. "You of all people should have known better. You knew exactly how it felt. And you did it to somebody else the first chance you got." The silence in the office was total. Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes had filled with something, and Daniel couldn't tell if it was anger or shame or grief or all 3 at once. Maybe it was the sound of a truth she'd spent years not looking at said out loud by the one person who had every right to want her destroyed. "That's not the same," she whispered. But there was no conviction in it. "It's exactly the same," Daniel said, not unkindly. "The only difference is I had a check big enough that somebody important came to check on me. You never got that. Nobody ever walked through the door and said 'sir' on your behalf. And I'm sorry about that. I mean it. I'm sorry nobody stood up for you." He paused. "But that doesn't give you the right to be the thing that hurt you. That's not justice. That's just passing the pain down to the next person in line." For a long moment, nobody moved. And then Victoria Hayes put her face in her hands. She didn't sob. She didn't fall apart theatrically. She just sat there with her hands over her face, very still, the way people do when something they've been holding up for years finally gets too heavy. And Daniel, who had every reason in the world to feel satisfaction, watching it, felt none. He felt tired. He felt sad. He felt the specific sadness of watching a person understand too late the shape of the thing they've become. Robert let the moment sit. Then he spoke, and his voice had softened, though it had not lost its firmness. "Ms. Hayes, the attempted deletion is now a corporate matter, and it's out of my hands. I can't protect you from that, even if I wanted to, and I want you to hear that clearly, so you don't waste energy hoping otherwise. What happens next with your employment, and anything beyond it, isn't mine to decide anymore. You made sure of that 15 minutes ago." Victoria didn't look up. "But I'm going to tell you something anyway," Robert continued, "because I think you need to hear it from somebody, and I don't think anyone's said it to you in a long time." He waited until she finally raised her head. "Your numbers were never the problem. You're good at this work. You're organized, you're driven. You built this branch up, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The problem was never whether you could do the job. The problem is that somewhere along the way, you decided that the way to matter was to make other people smaller. And that's a trap, Ms. Hayes, because it never fills the hole. You could have made regional manager, director, and you'd have still been standing behind that desk sorting people into who deserves your respect and who doesn't, and you'd have still felt exactly as empty as you feel right now. The check on the counter was never the thing that was going to fix you." Victoria stared at him, and the tears finally spilled over silent, and she made no move to wipe them. "I'd like you to gather your personal things," Robert said gently. "Marcus will accompany you, not because we think you'll take anything, but because that's the process, and the process protects you as much as it protects us. Corporate will be in touch about everything else." Victoria nodded slowly. She stood. Her legs seemed unsteady under her. She reached for her purse, and then she stopped, and she looked at Daniel one more time. "Why did you come back?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse. "When Whitmore called you. You were in the parking lot. You could have just left and let all of this happen without ever seeing me again. Why did you walk back in?" Daniel considered the question honestly. "Because my daughter was watching," he said. "The whole thing. She watched you tear up that check, and she watched a room full of people say nothing, and she asked me if we'd done something wrong." He paused. "And I realized that whatever I did next was the actual lesson. Not the words I say to her at bedtime. This. What she saw me do when it was real. If I drove away, she learns that the world is just cruel, and you keep your head down. If I came back, maybe she learned something else." He looked at Victoria steadily. "I didn't come back for you. I came back for her. But you got to be part of what she learned anyway. I hope you make it worth something." Victoria Hayes looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her purse, and she walked out of the office with Marcus a respectful step behind her, and Daniel watched the woman who'd torn up his check that afternoon walk through the lobby. She used to command past the staff who used to fear her, past the counter where it had all happened, and out the front door into the late afternoon, and he felt no triumph at all. He felt like he needed to go find his daughter. He walked back to the conference room. It was 3:40 by now. Lily had abandoned the animal cracker tower and was drawing on the back of a bank brochure with a pen she'd found somewhere. "Hey, baby," he said, sitting down beside her. "Is it over?" "The bad part's mostly over, yeah." She kept drawing. "Did the lady get in trouble?" Daniel thought about how to answer that. "She had to leave her job," he said, "because of the choices she made today." Lily nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Are you happy she got in trouble?" And there it was. The real question. The one that mattered more than any of it. "No," Daniel said honestly. "I'm not happy about it. I'm sad she made those choices, and I'm sad she has to face what comes next. But I'm glad the truth came out, because now maybe the next person who comes in here gets treated better. Those are two different things, and you can feel both at the same time." He tapped her drawing. "What are you making?" Lily turned the brochure around. She'd drawn a building with a lot of people inside it, all different sizes and over the door. She'd written in careful 7-year-old letters, "Everybody welcome." Daniel looked at it for a long moment, and something got tight in his throat. "That's the best bank I've ever seen," he said quietly. "Can we make a real one like that?" He looked at her drawing. Then he looked up, because Robert Whitmore was standing in the doorway, and Robert was looking at the drawing too, and Robert had heard the question. "Actually," Robert said, stepping into the room, "I think that's more or less what your dad and I were about to talk about, before all the excitement." He sat back down across from them. He set his folder on the table again. And Daniel noticed that the anger had drained out of the man's face and been replaced by something more focused, more determined. "Here's where I am," Robert said. "An hour ago I drove over here worried about protecting a partnership. That's the truth, and I'm not proud of it, but that's why I got in the car so fast. A 9-figure client got mistreated, and my first instinct was damage control." He shook his head. "But I've been in that lobby for the last hour, and I've listened to your staff, and I watched a man who got humiliated in front of his kid turn around and ask me to make sure it doesn't happen to the next stranger. And somewhere in there this stopped being about the partnership for me. I want you to know that." Daniel watched him carefully. "Okay, so I don't want to just fix this branch," Robert said. "Firing Victoria Hayes fixes one manager. It doesn't fix the thing that let her operate for years. It doesn't fix the fact that her staff were too scared to report her. It doesn't fix the fact that the housekeeper who waited 45 minutes never had anyone walk in on her behalf." He leaned forward. "You said something in that conference room earlier that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. You said 99 times out of 100 the guy who looks like you doesn't get rescued. He just gets shown the door and nobody ever finds out. That's the sentence I keep hearing. And I don't want to run a bank where that's true." "It's true at most banks," Daniel said quietly. "Not just yours." "I know, but I can only fix mine." Robert opened the folder. "So, here's what I'm proposing, and I want to be honest, that part of it is self-interested, because a bank that treats people better is also a better bank, and I'm not going to pretend I'm a saint. But the other part is that little girl's drawing, and I mean that." He slid a piece of paper across the table. "First, mandatory retraining across the region. Not the fake kind where everybody clicks through slides. Real training built around what happened here with your input if you're willing to give it. Every employee learns to verify before they judge. Every single one." Daniel looked at the paper. "Okay. Second, an independent complaint line. Not one that routes back to the branch manager, which is the whole reason nobody ever reported Hayes. A real one that goes to corporate, that a teller can call without their boss finding out. Whistleblower protection with teeth. Nobody loses their job for reporting mistreatment. Ever." "Sarah," Daniel said. "Sarah's the reason I'm putting it on the list," Robert said. "She had every reason to stay quiet, and she wrote down timestamps instead. I don't ever want an employee to have to be that brave again, just to do the right thing. Bravery shouldn't be a job requirement for basic decency." Daniel nodded slowly. He was starting to feel something he hadn't felt all day. Not vindication. Something better than that. The sense that a bad afternoon might turn into something that outlasted it. "And third," Robert said. He paused. "You mentioned you were going to use half that check to start a foundation. For single parents." Daniel went still. "How did you know that?" "You told my assistant, on the phone last week, when you scheduled the meeting." Robert almost smiled. "It's the reason I was so eager to meet you honestly. A client who wants to give away half his liquidity to help single parents is not a common phone call to get." Daniel looked down at the table. "My wife and I struggled," he said quietly. "Before the company took off, there were months I didn't know how I'd cover both childcare and rent. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table doing the math over and over, hoping it would come out different. And we had it easier than most, because I had a skill I could sell eventually. A lot of people don't get that eventually. They just get the math that never comes out right over and over for years." He looked up. "So yeah, half the check was going to start something. I hadn't figured out exactly what. Just that I wasn't going to sit on that money while people 2 towns over were doing the same math I used to do." Robert was quiet for a moment. "What if it wasn't just your money?" he said. Daniel looked at him. "What if the bank matched it?" Robert said. "What if the Carter Single Parent Foundation had Westbridge National behind it? Not as a marketing stunt. I don't mean a logo on a banner. I mean real infrastructure. financial literacy programs, low-barrier accounts for people who've been turned away everywhere else, emergency grants, and it launches out of this branch, the exact branch where a single father got told he didn't belong. He let that sit. I can't promise the board says yes to all of it, but I can promise I'll fight for it. And I think after today, I've got the leverage to win. The conference room was silent. Daniel Carter sat there and looked at a man he'd met 40 minutes ago, and he tried to find the catch because he'd spent enough years being disappointed by people to always look for the catch. He didn't find one. "You'd really do that," Daniel said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'd really do that," Robert said. "And I'll tell you why, since you're the kind of man who wants the real reason and not the pretty one. Partly it's good business, and I already admitted that. Partly it's because I've got 30 years in this industry, and I'd like the last chapter of it to be something I'm proud of instead of just numbers. But mostly," he glanced at Lily's drawing the crooked letters over the door, "everybody welcome. Mostly it's because a 7-year-old drew a picture of the bank I wish I'd been running this whole time. And I'm not going to be the guy who saw that drawing and did nothing. I've already got enough of those afternoons on my conscience." Lily, who had been listening in the way children listen, looked up at Robert. "You can use my drawing if you want," she offered. "For the real one." Robert looked at her, and for a second, the composed regional president couldn't quite speak. "I would be honored to use your drawing," he said finally. Daniel looked at his daughter, and then at Robert, and then down at the folder full of proposals on the table, and he felt the whole shape of the afternoon turn over one final time. Because he'd walked into this bank to deposit a check and been told he didn't belong. And now he was being asked to help rebuild the place from the inside out, so that the next person who looked like him would never hear those words at all. "Okay," Daniel said quietly. "Let's talk about how we do it right." And outside in the parking lot, a woman in a green coat who had been watching the front doors sat in her car and looked down at her phone, where the video she'd uploaded an hour ago had climbed past 200,000 views and was still at that very moment climbing fast. The video hit 1 million views by 9 o'clock that night. Daniel found out because his phone started buzzing on the kitchen counter while he was making Lily her macaroni and cheese, and it didn't stop. First, it was a number he didn't recognize, then another, then a text from his old business partner that just said, "Are you the guy in the bank video with 3 question marks?" He wiped his hands on a dish towel and picked up the phone. The woman in the green coat had titled it simply, "Bank Manager, Tears Up Single Dad's Check in Front of His Little Girl." She'd blurred Lily's face, which Daniel would be grateful for later, and she'd cut it clean. No commentary, no music. Just 12 minutes of exactly what happened. Victoria's voice refusing to make the call. The check coming apart. And then at the end, a little girl's voice asking her father if they'd done something wrong. That was the part that broke people. Daniel scrolled the comments and felt something cold settle in his stomach, because there were thousands of them, and they were angry, and a lot of them wanted blood. Someone find out this manager's name. She should never work again. Post where this bank is. People deserve to know. He set the phone down. Lily looked up from the table. "Daddy, your phone keeps making noise." "I know, baby. I'm going to turn it off in a minute." "Is it the bad thing again?" Daniel sat down across from her. He'd promised himself 4 years ago, standing in a hospital hallway with a 5-year-old who'd just lost her mother, that he would never lie to this child about hard things. Soften them, yes. Lie, never. "Somebody recorded what happened at the bank today," he said. "And they put it on the internet, and a lot of people saw it, more than a lot. And now those people are upset about what happened to us." Lily thought about that. "Is that good or bad?" "I don't know yet," Daniel said honestly. "It can be both." At 10:15, Robert Whitmore called. "You've seen it," Robert said. It wasn't a question. "I've seen it. It's on 3 news sites already. National ones. My phone hasn't stopped since 8. Robert's voice was tired but steady. "I need to know something, and I need you to be straight with me. Are you talking to the press? Because if you are, that's your right, and I'm not going to try to talk you out of it. I just need to know where I stand." "I'm not talking to anybody," Daniel said. "I didn't post it. I didn't know it was posted until an hour ago." Some woman in a green coat took it. She came up to me on the way out and apologized for not saying anything. I guess she decided saying nothing wasn't enough." There was a pause on the line. "A green coat," Robert said slowly. "Older woman. Gray hair. You know her. She was still in the lobby when I got there. She apologized to you as you were leaving." Robert exhaled. "Mr. Carter, that woman didn't just record it. She's been posting follow-ups. She had it right, the whole thing, the protocol violation, all of it. Somebody in the comments identified the branch. It's out. Everybody knows it's Westbridge Brookfield." Daniel closed his eyes. "That's what I was afraid of." "Why afraid?" "Because now there's a mob," Daniel said. "And a mob doesn't care about the truth. It cares about a target. Right now, there are thousands of people who want that woman destroyed, and half of them don't even know her name, and the other half are trying to find it. And when they find it, they're going to burn her whole life down. Her family. Everything." He rubbed his face. "I didn't want that. I never wanted that." There was a long silence on the phone. "You're a strange man, Daniel Carter," Robert said finally. "She humiliated you in front of your daughter and tried to delete the evidence, and you're up at 10 at night worried about protecting her from the internet." "I'm not worried about protecting her," Daniel said. "I'm worried about what the whole thing turns into. There's a difference between accountability and a bonfire. Accountability makes things better. A bonfire just makes everybody feel powerful for a night, and then it's ash and nothing actually changed." He paused. "I've seen what these things do to people, and I've got a daughter who's going to grow up watching how the adults around her handle power. I don't want the lesson she takes from today to be that the way you win is by getting a big enough crowd to hate the right person." Robert was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he asked. And that was the first time all day that Robert Whitmore had asked Daniel that question, instead of the other way around. Something had shifted. Daniel wasn't the customer anymore. He'd become something closer to a partner. "I want to get ahead of it," Daniel said, "before it turns into something none of us can steer. I think we make a statement, together, tomorrow. And I think it's not about Victoria at all. Not about her, she's the whole story. She's the whole story right now," Daniel said. "That's the problem. As long as it's about one bad manager getting what she deserved, it's just entertainment. People watch, they get their outrage hit, they move on, and nothing changes. But if we make it about what we're building, the training, the complaint line, the foundation, then it stops being a story about one woman and starts being a story about how a bank actually fixed itself. That's the version that helps the next person." He paused. "The mob wants a villain. Let's give them a solution instead. It's less satisfying. It's also the only thing that matters." There was a long silence. "I've got a board meeting at 8 a.m., Robert said. "Emergency session. Half of them want to put out a statement distancing the company from Hayes and call it done. Contain it, protect the brand, move on." He paused. "You just gave me something better to walk in there with. Can you be there?" "Not in the room. The board would never allow a client in the room. But nearby. On a phone if I need you." "I'll be there," Daniel said. "But Robert, there's one thing I need you to promise me." "Name it." "When you fire her, and I know you have to the deletion made that certain, you don't feed her to the crowd. You don't release her name. You don't put out a statement that turns her into the face of everything wrong with banking, so the company looks good by comparison. She did a terrible thing. She's going to lose her career, and probably a lot more. That's already the consequence. You don't get to also use her as a marketing prop for how enlightened the bank is now." Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. "If we're going to be better than she was, we start by not doing to her the thing everybody online is about to do to her." The line was silent for a long moment. "You know," Robert said, "in 30 years, I've had exactly one client tell me to protect the person who wronged them. One. And it's you tonight on the phone at 10:30. He exhaled. "You have my word. Her name doesn't come from us." The next morning at 7:45, Daniel dropped Lily at school. She'd asked to bring her drawing, the one of the bank with "Everybody welcome" over the door, and Daniel had let her, and as she climbed out of the truck, she turned back. "Daddy, is today going to be a good day or a bad day?" "I'm going to try to make it a good one," he said. That's all I can promise. I'm going to try. Okay. She considered this with her mother's seriousness. I'll try too. At school. He watched her walk in. Then he drove to a coffee shop across the street from the regional headquarters and waited with his phone in his hand. At 8 o'clock, the board meeting started. At 8:40, Robert called. It's going sideways, Robert said, and his voice was tight. The legal team got wind of the deletion, and now half the board is terrified this becomes a lawsuit. They want to bury everything. Full NDA quiet settlement with Hayes to make sure she doesn't talk statement that says as little as possible. They're scared, Daniel. Scared people make small decisions. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. They want to pay her to be quiet. They want to make it all disappear. The video, the story, Hayes, you, all of it. There's a faction in there arguing we should offer you a settlement too with a non-disparagement clause. Make you go away. Buy my silence. That's the phrase somebody used, yes, not me. I want to be clear, it wasn't me. Daniel sat in the coffee shop and felt the whole thing balanced on a knife's edge. Because this was the moment. This was where the good version of the story and the bad version split apart. The bank could do the thing every big institution does, make the problem quiet. Pay everyone to stop talking. Issue a statement, so vague, it meant nothing, and in 6 months, it would be like it never happened. Victoria would be gone, but so would the training, the complaint line, the foundation, all of it. Buried under legal caution and a settlement check. Robert, Daniel said. Can you get me in that room? I told you the board won't allow. Not physically. On speaker, right now. Put me on speaker and let me say one thing. Daniel, these people are lawyers and executives. They're not going to. You said the video's at over 1 million views. You said national news picked it up. That gives me exactly one kind of power in this situation, and it's the only kind those people understand. Daniel's voice was calm and hard. Put me on speaker, Robert. Let me remind them what happens if they try to bury this, and it gets out that they tried to bury it. Because right now, they think the danger is the story. I want to explain to them that the real danger is the cover-up. They already have one manager who tried to delete the evidence. Do they really want to be the board that did the exact same thing on a bigger scale? There was a silence. Hold on, Robert said. Daniel heard the muffled sound of a hand over a phone. Voices. Argument. A full minute of it. Then Robert's voice came back clearer. You're on speaker, he said. The board is listening. Mr. Carter, go ahead. Daniel took a breath. Good morning, he said. My name is Daniel Carter. Yesterday, one of your branch managers tore up a $5 million check in front of my 7-year-old daughter because she decided a man in a work jacket couldn't possibly have earned it. Then, after being told not to, she tried to delete the security footage to hide what she'd done. I understand you're all lawyers and executives with responsibilities to protect this company, and I respect that. So I'm going to talk to you in the language of protecting the company. Nobody interrupted. Right now, you think you have a problem, and you think the problem is the video, Daniel continued. It's not. The video is already out. 1 million people have seen it. You can't unring that bell. So the question isn't how to make the story go away. The story is not going away. The only question left is what the second story is going to be. Because there's always a second story. And the second story is the one you're writing right now in that room. He let that sit. You have 2 choices, he said. Choice 1, you pay everyone to be quiet, you issue a statement full of words that mean nothing, and you hope it blows over. And maybe it does. But here's what you're risking. You have an employee who tried to delete evidence. That fact exists. It's documented. If it ever comes out, and things always come out, that the board's response to a viral video of discrimination was to quietly pay everyone off and hide the evidence deletion. Then you're not the bank that had one bad manager anymore. You're the bank that covered it up from the top. That's a different story. That's the story that ends careers in that room. Not mine. Yours. Silence on the line. He could feel them listening now. Really listening. Choice 2, Daniel said, and his voice softened. You get in front of it. Today. You announce real mandatory retraining and independent complaint line that actually protects the people who use it and a foundation launched from that exact branch to help the kind of people your manager decided didn't belong. You don't name her. You don't throw her to the mob that just makes you look vindictive, and it invites a wrongful termination fight anyway. You simply say, "This happened. It was wrong. And here is specifically what we're doing, so it never happens again." And then you actually do it. He paused. "I'm not asking you to do the right thing because it's right, though it is. I'm telling you the right thing and the smart thing are for once the exact same thing. The bank that fixes itself in public becomes the most trusted bank in the region. The bank that pays everyone to shut up becomes a lawsuit and a follow-up video. I've already been offered a settlement to go away quietly. I want it on the record with all of you listening that I'm turning it down. I don't want your money. I've got money. What I want is for you to be brave enough to do the thing that actually works." The line went quiet. For 5 full seconds, nobody said anything. Then a voice Daniel didn't recognize, older, careful, the voice of someone used to being the final word in rooms like that, spoke. "Mr. Carter, this is Eleanor Vance. I chair the board." A pause. "Am I understanding correctly that you're declining a settlement on the record, and instead asking us to spend money building a foundation and reforming our procedures?" "Yes, ma'am. You realize most people in your position would take the check and the apology and go home." "I'm aware. Why aren't you—" Daniel looked out the window of the coffee shop across the street at the tall glass building where a room full of powerful people were deciding what kind of company they wanted to be. "Because my daughter drew a picture," he said. "Yesterday, while all this was happening, she drew a picture of a bank where everybody's welcome. She wrote it over the door in crayon. Everybody welcome. And she asked me if we could make a real one." His voice was steady. "I've got a chance to tell my little girl that yes, we can. That when something unfair happens, you don't just get angry, and you don't just take a check to go away quiet, you build the better thing. I'm 51 years old, Ms. Vance." He paused. "I don't get many chances to teach her something that big. I'm not going to trade this one for a settlement." The silence that followed was different, softer. "Mr. Whitmore," Eleanor Vance said, "take Mr. Carter off speaker, please. The board needs to deliberate." The line clicked. Daniel sat in the coffee shop, his coffee long cold, and waited. 25 minutes passed. They were the longest 25 minutes of Daniel's day. He thought about Maria. He thought about what she'd say if she could see him, a man who used to do the kitchen table math on childcare and rent, sitting in a coffee shop, having just turned down a settlement he could have used to fund the whole foundation himself, betting instead on a room full of strangers finding their better nature. She'd probably tell him he was being reckless. And then she'd probably tell him she was proud of him. She was capable of both at once. That was one of the things he'd loved most about her. At 9:25, Robert called back. Daniel answered on the first ring. "Well," Robert didn't say anything for a second. "Robert, what happened?" "They voted," Robert said, and his voice had something in it Daniel couldn't quite read. "It wasn't unanimous. There were 3 holdouts who wanted to bury it right up to the end." He paused. "But Eleanor Vance stood up at the end and said something I'm going to remember for the rest of my life. She said, 'We can be the story we're afraid of, or we can be the story we'd be proud to tell our grandchildren.' I've spent 40 years being afraid. I'm too old to keep doing it." Daniel's chest tightened. "And they approved all of it," Robert said, and now there was something like wonder in his voice. "The retraining, the independent complaint line, and the foundation. Daniel, they didn't just approve the match. Vance pushed them to double it. The bank's putting in $5 million to your 2.5. The Carter Single Parent Foundation launches from the Brookfield branch in 6 weeks, funded at $7.5 million. And the board voted to name the initiative after—" Robert's voice caught. "They want to call the Community Access Program the Everybody Welcome Initiative. Vance asked if we could get permission to use the phrase, 'from your daughter.'" Daniel put his hand over his mouth. He sat in the coffee shop, 51 years old, a widower who'd built a company from nothing and lost the love of his life and raised a little girl alone, and he could not speak for a moment. "Daniel," Robert said, "you still there?" "Yeah," Daniel managed. "Yeah, I'm here." "You did that," Robert said quietly. "You understand that, right? I couldn't have gotten them there. Legal had them scared stiff. It was you on that speaker telling a room full of people twice your net worth, that the smart move and the right move were the same thing. Eleanor Vance told me afterward, it was the daughter's drawing that did it. The crayon over the door. She's got grandkids, and she said she couldn't look at that and vote to bury it. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Tell Ms. Vance she can use the phrase, he said. But tell her it's not mine to give. She has to ask Lily. And I'm warning you, Lily drives a hard bargain. Last week she negotiated an extra bedtime story out of me by pointing out I'd technically promised. Robert laughed, and it was the first time all day either of them had laughed. I'll set up the meeting, Robert said. Ms. Vance meets your negotiator, God help her. That afternoon, Daniel picked Lily up from school. She climbed into the truck with her backpack and her lunchbox, and immediately started telling him about a boy named Marcus in her class who'd shared his fruit snacks, and Daniel listened to every word because he'd learned a long time ago that the small stuff was actually the big stuff, that a father who couldn't be bothered with fruit snacks had no business claiming he cared about anything larger. When she finished, he said, "Hey, remember that drawing you made yesterday? The bank one. The everybody welcome one. That one." He pulled out of the school lot. Some very important people saw it, and they want to use those words, for real, on a real program that's going to help a lot of families. Lily's eyes went wide. My words. Your words. The ones I wrote in crayon. Those exact ones. Lily was quiet for a moment, processing the enormity of this. Then, with the pure practical logic of a 7-year-old, she said, "Do I get paid?" Daniel burst out laughing so hard he had to blink to keep his eyes on the road. "We'll negotiate," he said. "There's a lady named Ms. Vance who wants to talk to you about it. She's very important and very smart, so you'll have to bring your best arguments." Lily nodded solemnly, already preparing. "I want a horse." "You're not getting a horse. I'll start with a horse and go down from there. That's how you do it. You told me that." Daniel looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror. This small person who'd watched a man be humiliated and a check torn to pieces and a room full of adults do nothing, and who had responded to all of it by drawing a better world and then asking to be paid for it. And he felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Not happiness exactly. Something bigger than happiness. Something like the feeling of watching a seed you didn't know you'd planted push up through the ground. "You're your mother's daughter," he said quietly. "You know that. Is that good?" "That's the best thing there is," Daniel said. "That's the very best thing there is." And as they drove home, Daniel's phone sat silent in the cup holder, the mob still churning somewhere out there, still hungry for a name he would never give them while across town. In a glass building, a 70-year-old woman named Eleanor Vance sat at a boardroom table looking at a photo someone had printed of a child's crayon drawing. "Everybody welcome," spelled out in careful crooked letters, and thought about the 40 years she'd spent being afraid, and quietly began to write in her own hand the first real speech she'd given in a decade that she actually believed. 6 weeks later, Daniel Carter walked back through the doors of the Brookfield branch of Westbridge National Bank, and this time, nobody moved to stop him. This time, a woman at the counter looked up and smiled and said, "Good morning, welcome to Westbridge," to the man in front of him, a man in a paint-stained jacket holding a folded check and looking Daniel could tell instantly like he was bracing to be turned away. Daniel watched the whole thing from a few feet back. He watched the teller take the man's check without a second glance at his clothes. He watched her verify it the way it was supposed to be verified with a quick phone call, professional and kind. He watched the man's shoulders come down from around his ears, the exact way Daniel's own had come down in that conference room 6 weeks earlier. The man left with his money and a receipt, and something else he'd walked in without the simple ordinary dignity of being treated like he belonged. Nobody in the branch knew that the whole reason that moment happened the way it did was standing 10 feet away in a clean shirt he'd bought special for the occasion. Daniel had almost not bought the shirt. He'd stood in his closet that morning, looking at his usual work clothes, and part of him had wanted to wear exactly what he'd worn 6 weeks ago, the same jacket, the same boots as a kind of statement. But then he'd thought better of it. Because the point had never been to prove he could clean up. The point had been that it shouldn't have mattered either way. So he'd bought a nice shirt because it was a big day, and he'd kept his old boots on because they were comfortable, and both of those things were allowed to be true at once. "Mr. Carter." He turned. Robert Whitmore was crossing the lobby toward him, hand already extended, and the man looked 10 years younger than he had 6 weeks ago. The tiredness was gone from his face. Something had lifted. "You made it," Robert said, shaking his hand warmly. "Wouldn't miss it. Where's my daughter's client?" Robert laughed. "Ms. Vance is in the conference room going over her notes. She's terrified, I think. She told me this morning she's negotiated billion-dollar mergers, and she's more nervous about this meeting than any of them." He lowered his voice. "Did Lily actually prepare?" "She's got a folder," Daniel said gravely. "She made a folder, Robert. She's 7, and she made a negotiating folder. There's a horse drawn on the front." God help us all. They walked toward the conference room together, and as they walked, Daniel took in what the branch had become. The lobby looked the same, more or less, same counters, same carpet. But there was a framed poster near the entrance that hadn't been there before, and Daniel slowed to read it. It laid out in plain language every customer's right to have their transaction verified before it was refused. It listed the independent complaint line, a real number, not one that routed back to any manager. And at the bottom, in a simple font, it read, "Everybody welcome, no exceptions." Daniel stood in front of it for a moment longer than he meant to. "We put one in every branch in this region," Robert said quietly beside him. 41 branches. That exact language. Your daughter's language. Daniel didn't trust himself to say anything, so he just nodded. Inside the conference room, Lily sat at the head of the long table in a chair that swallowed her whole, her feet not reaching the floor, her negotiating folder squared up neatly in front of her. Across from her sat Eleanor Vance, 70 years old, chair of the board of a bank with assets in the tens of billions, wearing a tailored gray suit and an expression of profound and genuine concentration. "And so," Lily was saying as Daniel and Robert came in, "if you use my words, that's a lot of words on a lot of signs. My dad says 41 signs." 41, Eleanor confirmed seriously. "That's correct. That's a lot." Lily consulted her folder. "So I think I should get a horse. I was afraid you'd say that." Eleanor folded her hands on the table. "Here's my difficulty, Ms. Carter. A horse is a very large commitment. It needs a barn. It needs a field. It needs someone to care for it every single day, even when you're at school. Do you have a barn?" Lily frowned. "No." "Do you have a field?" "No. So the horse, I'm afraid, presents some logistical problems." Eleanor leaned forward, and there was a twinkle in her eye that Daniel suspected very few people in her boardroom had ever seen. "But I understand the principle. You did important work. The words came from you, and important work should be recognized. So let me make you a counteroffer." Lily narrowed her eyes exactly the way Daniel narrowed his when a contractor quoted him a suspicious price. "What's a counteroffer?" "It's when someone says no to your first idea, but yes to a different idea that's still good," Eleanor explained. "My counteroffer is this: not a horse, but riding lessons. Once a week at a real stable with real horses that you don't have to feed or clean up after. You get the horse for an hour, and then it's someone else's problem." She sat back. "And a scholarship in your name held until you're 18 for your education. Because the girl who drew that picture is going to do things someday, and I'd like to help pay for them." The room was very quiet. Lily looked at her father. Daniel gave a small shrug that meant, "This is your negotiation, kid." Lily looked back at Eleanor. She considered the offer with the full weight of her 7 years. "Riding lessons every week," Lily said slowly. "And I don't have to clean up the horse. Not once. And school money. For whenever you're ready for it." Lily stuck out her small hand across the enormous table. "Deal." Eleanor Vance, chair of the board, shook the hand of a 7-year-old girl with the same gravity she'd have brought to signing a merger, and Daniel Carter stood in the doorway and watched the two of them, 70 years apart, seal a deal over a crayon drawing, and he thought his heart might actually come apart in his chest. Afterward, while Lily was being shown the break room and its legendary animal crackers by Sarah Eleanor Vance, came and stood beside Daniel near the window. "That is a remarkable child," she said. "She gets it from her mother." "I doubt that's entirely true." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Mr. Carter, I've been chairing that board for 11 years, and I sat on it for 20 before that. 31 years. And in all that time, I never once turned it in a direction it didn't already want to go. I was very good at reading which way the wind was blowing and standing in front of the crowd like I was leading it. She looked at him. Your speech 6 weeks ago. On the speakerphone. That was the first time in 3 decades I voted against the wind. And I've been thinking about why, and I want to tell you because I think you should know. Daniel waited. It wasn't the business argument, Eleanor said. Though it was a good one. It wasn't even the drawing, though, that certainly didn't help my composure. She paused. It was the thing you said about your daughter, that you don't get many chances to teach her something that big. I have 4 grandchildren, Mr. Carter. And I sat in that room, and I realized I had spent my entire career being exactly the kind of person I'd be ashamed to have them find out I was. Careful, cautious, always protecting the institution and never the person. Her voice thickened slightly. I'm 70 years old. I don't have many chances left to be someone my grandchildren would be proud of. You reminded me not to waste one. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. For what it's worth, he said. I think you just spent one well. Eleanor Vance smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had very late in life remembered something about herself she'd forgotten she had. The launch event was the following week. They held it in the Brookfield branch, and they kept it small on purpose. No press circus, no ribbon-cutting spectacle. Daniel had insisted on that. The Carter Single Parent Foundation and the Everybody Welcome Initiative would announce themselves through what they did not, through a photo op. But there were a few reporters, the respectful kind, and there were the staff, and there were the first families. The foundation was going to help who'd been quietly identified through community centers and schools across the region. And there was Sarah Mitchell, who was no longer a customer relations rep. Branch manager, Daniel said, reading the new placard on her desk. They gave you the branch. Sarah smiled, though her eyes were wet. Mr. Whitmore said the person who should run a branch is the one who did the right thing when it cost her something. His words. She shook her head. 4 years I was scared of losing this job. And it turns out the thing that almost got me fired is the thing that got me promoted. I still can't make sense of it. It makes perfect sense, Daniel said. You just spent 4 years in a place where the sense was backwards. It's right side up now. That's all that changed. Marcus was there too, and Robert had made him head of regional security, and when Daniel shook his hand, the big man held on a second longer than a normal handshake. You know, I almost didn't lock that system in time, Marcus said quietly. Another 30 seconds, and the file's gone, and it's your word against hers. I think about that. But you did lock it, Daniel said. You moved when it mattered. That's the whole thing, Marcus. That's the only thing. Everybody's got a moment where they either move or they don't. You moved. Robert gave a short speech, awkward, heartfelt, the speech of a numbers man, reaching for words that didn't come naturally about what the initiative meant and what the bank was committing to. And then, to Daniel's surprise, he stepped aside and said there was someone else who wanted to say something. Eleanor Vance walked to the front of the room. She was holding a single piece of paper, handwritten, and Daniel recognized it as the speech Robert had mentioned, the first one in a decade she'd actually believed. My name is Eleanor Vance, she began. I chair the board of this bank. 6 weeks ago, a manager at this branch tore up a check in front of a little girl because she looked at that child's father and decided he didn't matter. She looked up from the paper. I want to tell you the truth about what happened after that, because the truth is the whole point. When the board first heard about it, our instinct was to make it quiet, to protect ourselves, to do honestly a more polished version of exactly what that manager did, decide that the easy thing mattered more than the right thing. The room was silent. We were talked out of it, Eleanor continued, by the very man we'd wronged, who turned down a settlement and asked us instead to build something. I have been in banking for 31 years, and I have never been more ashamed of an institution's first instinct or more proud of where it finally landed. She folded the paper. She didn't need it anymore. There's a phrase on the wall of every branch in this region now. Everybody welcome. No exceptions. Those aren't corporate words. A 7-year-old wrote them in crayon on the worst day of her father's recent life. And they are now the truest thing this company has ever said about itself. We intend to spend the rest of our existence earning them. She looked directly at Daniel then. Mr. Carter, you taught your daughter something big that day. I want you to know you taught the rest of us something too. Thank you. The applause that followed was not the loud kind. It was better than that. It was the quiet, sustained kind, the kind that comes from people who mean it. Daniel stood at the back with his hand on Lily's shoulder, and he didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would have been better than the moment itself. Later after, the families had talked with the foundation staff, and the reporters had gone, and the room had emptied out. Daniel and Lily were among the last to leave. Lily had spent the afternoon befriending every other child in the room, and was now pleasantly exhausted, leaning against her father's leg. "Daddy," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Always." "That lady, the first one, the one who ripped the check." Lily looked up at him. Whatever happened to her? Daniel had wondered when this question would come. He'd known it would eventually. The truth was, he didn't entirely know. Victoria Hayes had been terminated, the deletion had made that certain, and the bank had kept its word and never released her name to the mob that had hunted for it. Somewhere out there, she was starting over or trying to. Daniel had heard secondhand that she'd moved to another state. He hoped in a distant and complicated way that she'd found whatever she'd actually been looking for behind that manager's desk. The thing that making other people small had never once given her. But that was a lot to explain to a 7-year-old. So Daniel crouched down to Lily's level, the way he always did when something mattered. "She lost her job," he said, "because of the choices she made. And then she went somewhere else to start over. Is she okay?" "I don't know, baby. I hope so." Lily frowned, working through it. "But she was mean to us. Why do you hope she's okay?" And there it was again. The real question. The one that had been underneath the whole thing from the very first moment when a check hit the floor in pieces, and a little girl asked if they'd done something wrong. Daniel took his daughter's hands. "Because hoping she's okay doesn't cost me anything," he said. "And staying angry at her forever would cost me a lot. It would make me carry her around in my chest for the rest of my life, taking up room where better things could go. She already took one afternoon from us. I'm not going to let her have any more than that." He squeezed her hands gently. "You can hold somebody accountable and still hope they find their way. Those aren't opposites, Lily. A lot of people think they are. They're not." Lily looked at him for a long moment with her mother's dark, serious eyes. "So we won," she said finally. "But we didn't have to make her lose." Daniel felt his breath catch. Because that was it. That was the whole thing. That was the lesson he'd been trying to teach her since the moment the check came apart. The lesson he wasn't sure he'd landed the lesson. He'd have given anything for her to understand, and she'd just said it back to him better than he could have said it himself in 11 words, standing in the middle of a bank that had been rebuilt around her crayon drawing. "Yeah, baby," he managed. "That's exactly it. We won. And we didn't have to make her lose." Lily nodded, satisfied the matter settled in the clean and total way that children settle things. Then she yawned enormously and announced, "I'm hungry. Can we get macaroni?" Daniel laughed, and it came out a little wet. "Yeah," he said, standing and taking her hand. "We can get macaroni." They walked toward the doors together. The tall, quiet man and the small, serious girl past the counter where it had all begun, past the framed poster that carried her words, past Sarah at the manager's desk, who lifted a hand to wave goodbye, and past Marcus, who nodded at them from the door. And as they stepped out into the afternoon, Daniel Carter thought about the man he'd been 6 weeks ago, a man who'd walked into this building carrying a check and walked out carrying humiliation. A man who'd sat in his truck in the parking lot wondering what his daughter had just learned about the world. Now he knew what she'd learned. She'd learned that a person's worth is never the number in their account. She'd learned that the room stays silent until someone decides to speak, and that you can be the one who speaks. She'd learned that you can be wronged and still refuse to become the wrong. She'd learned that the truest victory isn't watching someone who hurt you fall. It's building a world where they couldn't have hurt you in the first place, and neither could anyone else ever again. She'd learned all of that at 7 years old, standing beside her father, watching him choose over and over the harder and better thing. Daniel had walked into that bank with a $5 million check. He walked out 6 weeks later with something no check could ever buy, holding the hand of a little girl who already understood the one truth it had taken him 51 years and the worst afternoon of his life to fully learn: that every single person deserves dignity before they ever have to prove they've earned it, and that the bravest thing a person can do with power is use it to make sure the next person never needs any. That is where the story ends. Not with a torn check. With a father, a daughter, and a world made one. Bank kinder, and a lesson that will outlive every dollar Daniel